Welcome, everyone. My name is Doug Kysar, and I am delighted to welcome you to our first speaker event of the spring semester. I'm the faculty co-director of the Law, Ethics, and Animals program at Yale Law School, and I am very excited to introduce our speaker today, Karen Bradshaw. Karen is a professor of law and Mary Sigler Fellow at the Arizona State University Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. She holds numerous other faculty affiliate titles, both at ASU and with the Classical Liberal Institute at New York University School of Law. Professor Bradshaw has published over 20 academic articles, many of which have been selected as being among the best articles of the year by her peers in the fields of environmental law, administrative law, land use law, and natural resources law. Professor Bradshaw is the author of the book Wildlife as Property Owners, A New Conception of Animal Rights. This is the book that she'll be discussing with us today. She's also a contributing co-editor of the book Wildfire Policy, Law, and Economic Perspectives. Her work has been discussed in numerous media outlets, including NPR, Fortune, Bloomberg, the New York Times, and the Arizona Republic. In 2020, Professor Bradshaw received the Stegner Young Scholar Award, which is an annual award recognizing an early career environmental law scholar for their accomplishments and promise within the field. She graduated with honors from the University of Chicago Law School, where she was an editor on the Law Review. After law school, she clerked for Judge E. Grady Jolly of the Fifth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals. Prior to law school, she earned an MBA degree while working full-time. As someone who teaches in Yale's executive MBA program, I have enormous respect for anyone who can complete that degree while simultaneously fulfilling their professional and personal responsibilities. Now, speaking of the personal, I feel compelled to point out that Professor Bradshaw is from a former mill town of 1,200 people at the base of Mount Shasta, California. That gives us a special connection to Professor Bradshaw because our own faculty member, Bob Ellickson, did his landmark field research on social norms and extra legal ordering in none other than Shasta County, California. And as we will soon hear, Professor Bradshaw's wonderful book resonates with the intellectual tradition of property scholarship that Bob and others pioneered. Now, before we move on to Professor Bradshaw's presentation, please let me remind you to keep yourself muted unless we call on you during the Q&A portion of our session. You can either submit questions directly to me via the private chat function at any time, or you can also use the raise hand button to add yourself to the queue for Q&A. Thank you, and please take it away, Karen.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Doug. I am delighted to be here, and I am so excited to give this talk at a really new and exciting program that I think will set the course for animal and environmental law scholarship nationally in the years ahead. I'm so excited about what you and Noah and Viveka and Pascal are doing collectively at Yale, and I'm honored to be part of your speaker series this semester. So thank you for having me, and congratulations and Godspeed on your good work at the organization there. So today I'm talking about the book, Wildlife as Property Owners, A New Conception of Animal Rights. And just to begin, the basic fundamental idea in this book is that animals should have the opportunity to own property and trust. And specifically, that creating this regime will make marked improvements in the fate of wildlife in the United States and worldwide today. So that's sort of the basic overview. But what underlies this book is a notion that law needs to redefine its relationship with nature. And specifically with wildlife, that we need to understand that what we're doing in animal law and environmental law and property law and the related fields is fundamentally describing the ways in which we choose to govern our relationship with other species and places and living things. And this is a marked departure from where we are today in animal law and property law, but it is in some ways an opportunity to revisit traditional ideology, governance, and law from people worldwide. It really draws upon sort of braiding the common law tradition that we have and embrace in the United States today with modern statutory approaches like the Endangered Species Act and Animal Welfare Act, but also revisiting indigenous conceptions of human relationships with nature. So, what I'm calling for in this book is, in some ways, a narrow proposal, which is to create the opportunity for wildlife to own and trust, but also presents an opportunity to look more broadly at how we think about animal law, how we think about environmental law, and whether the rights of nature might be a step forward in continuing this movement to do better by our co-participants with property rights on Earth, right? So we live in an environmental setting, the Earth, which is rich and has many different ecosystems. We share those physical spaces with other living things, ranging from plants to animals to bacteria. And yet our law for so long has focused on animals as, in some ways, sort of the property of human beings. And then more recently with the animal rights movement as the things that might have some place in legal thought, but not so much a place, a home within property law and its institutions. So radically sort of reviewing these concepts with fresh eyes give us an opportunity to reflect on where animal law is today and where it might go in the future. So in the talk today, I hope to convince you that biodiversity loss is a major problem. I personally think it is the largest crisis that we face today, and it's largely hidden. I hope to discuss animal law. It seems fitting, being at this new and important program at Yale Law School, to reflect how the legal academy and the practice of law is helping animals and what it has done, what it can do, and what it could do better. And then also to think about property law and the rights of nature. Right? How do these fields interact? The rights of nature, of course, is this growing social movement that's happening worldwide. And yet, almost before it even really starts and gets off the ground in the United States, we have scholars and courts looking at it somewhat askance, thinking perhaps this isn't a route down which we should go. And I think this talk and this article and this book, sort of this set of thinking on these issues, collectively says actually the rights of nature have always existed in law. If we look to common law principles, which is the passing down of ideas over time, we have the opportunity to reinvigorate these old ideas under the new guise of rights of nature and take animal law from its present place, which is important and vital, but also insignificant or insufficient for wildlife, and make it something that is far more meaningful in addressing this crisis of biodiversity that we face today. So that's the talk in a nutshell. I look forward to sort of going into the specifics of this. And then at the end, of course, we'll have questions and answers. And I look forward to engaging your ideas from the different communities and perspectives that are represented today. So thank you for coming. So let me start by thanking you, but then move on quickly to depressing you. So this may not be particularly new to many of the people who are part of this conversation today, but biodiversity loss is at a crisis moment. We are at this tipping point of widespread mass extinction, trophic collapse on a worldwide level. Many of our ecosystems are at risk. So first, some statistics. The World Wildlife Foundation has noted that there has been a 60% decline in species over the last several decades. 60%, a shocking number. 4% of the Earth's mammals, as measured by biomass, are wildlife, which means that 96% of humans and human-owned livestock comprise 96% of the biomass. So this huge amount of human and human-owned livestock comprising the mammalian biomass on Earth. We have 1 out of 60 species that are anticipated to go extinct by 2050, according to scientific estimation. And this will be familiar if anyone has spent COVID, as I did, watching Tiger King. There are more tigers in backyards in the United States today than there are in the wild worldwide. So these shocking numbers, right, this shocking sort of set of data points that tell us that we're on a crisis of biodiversity. And this is something that scientists and journalists have reported to the public as well. We have Elizabeth Kolbert's book, The Sixth Extinction, which talks about us being at the precipice of this sort of watershed moment of extinction that might cause human life to extinguish as well. And then we also have a solution. So the scientific community has E.O. Wilson, a famed sociobiologist and conservationist who has written the book Half Earth. And E.O. Wilson says what we really need to fix this problem of biodiversity loss is to set aside half of the landmass on Earth for wildlife. And so we have this great information. We have the problem, which we know of, and we have the solution, which is simply give animals the habitat they need. But the question is, why haven't we done it? If we know we have this problem, if we know what the potential solution is, why aren't we simply implementing it? And the answer, of course, rests in institutions, right? We have the legal framework, the legal structures, the legal government structures that are collectively creating sort of resistance to the social movement or the political movement that we need to treat animals better, to create homes for wildlife, to create conservation measures that we need to undertake in order to fix this biodiversity crisis in which we find ourselves. And so, in order to really understand where we need to go, we must first understand how we got there. And that sort of requires looking at two things. First, the field of animal law, and then secondarily, the field of property law. And looking at those collectively present some of the shortcomings of the approaches that we have taken thus far to wildlife, but also shows the places that we can go to fix the problems. And I think it's important to just sort of pause here and say, starting with animal law, it is very tempting, if one reads the scholarship, to begin with animal law as sort of the English common law system that was imported to the United States. Scholars often, and this is important scholarship, but they look to medieval Europe to think about the ways in which animal law developed over time. And that is important scholarship, but it's not sufficient on its own. I think living in the United States as we do, we must understand that we have a rich braid of different cultural histories and practices throughout the United States that should also be acknowledged and taken into account. We have centuries old indigenous practices, which are highly variable, right? There are over 500 indigenous governments today throughout the United States, each of which has individual cultures, practices, laws, et cetera. And it's inappropriate to try to group those too broadly. But to say that there are indigenous animal law principles that are important, worthy of scholarship, and worth examining is an understatement. We have this tremendous, wonderful body of indigenous principles that are both historical and also living in the United States today that need to inform animal law scholarship. And the good news is they are. Animal law scholarship in sort of its canonical version tends to, in some ways, emphasize the European origins of animal law, but increasingly the rights of nature movement is teaching us about indigenous animal law practices. So I'll begin with that. One of the benefits of looking to indigenous animal law practices is that we are able to think about animal law in the context and origin in which it was developed. Right. And one of the things we know from sciences, sociology, sustainability literatures is that ideas matter for the place in which they occur. That is to say, people are highly responsive to their local conditions. So the fact that I am from Siskiyou County, which is adjacent to Shasta County, matters a lot when I attended law school. And when I went on to scholarship, my views are informed from the childhood I had and the place I am from. And that is true for each of us, no matter where we are from, we are informed by our place. And it is foolish to think that laws are not also responsive to the geographic and climatic and social and political and economic, but also the vegetative and the wildlife sort of pieces that go together to that place. So laws that are responsive to their natural environment, I believe, have an advantage over laws that are sort of uniform, sort of stamped on to the landscape. And this is supported, of course, by the Nobel Prize winning work of Elinor Ostrom, which talks about resource users being particularly well situated to governing the resources in their natural environment. And I think it's a natural extension of that idea to suggest that laws also are highly responsive to the underlying condition. And this is particularly true for the human relationships with other animals, other living things within a natural context. So in animal law discussions, I always like to begin with the idea that there are many widespread important indigenous beliefs and scholars doing work on that. And if you're interested in particular scholars, I cite them in my forthcoming article, Humans as Animals, which talks about the idea that humans should be treated as one of many animals and we should redefine the way in which we think of animal law as sort of our relationship with other species instead of how humans can treat and interact with one another. And that cites a number of indigenous scholars. The second benefit to looking at Indigenous voices in animal law, in addition to that history and the development in a particularized place, is the concept that there are answers to problems that Western law has failed to address for a long time. So one of the overarching concerns in animal law in the US, as I'll soon mention, is the idea of taking somewhat extreme positions in how to relate with animals. And a sticking point, jurisprudential sticking point, that Judge Posner and others have talked about is the slippery slope problem of animal law. Where animal advocates want to get is so far from where we are today that even incremental small changes to which most people could agree are derailed by public fear of where making those initial changes might go. I.e., if we make a small step today, we might end up in a very different place where our rights or thoughts of rights are impeded in the future. And so Judge Posner and other judges have shown some resistance to embracing early animal rights or animal advocacy movement because they're forecasting the end goal in mind. And this is particularly true on the issue of meat and the eating of meat, the killing of animals for food. It's interesting to note this is a shifting thing. I heard a statistic a few years ago that there are more vegans than hunters in the United States today. I noticed that my environmental law students, some of whom are on the call today, I noticed that they tend to be vegan and vegetarian at rates that are greater than my peers and my parents' sort of generation. And so there is a movement among millennials on this issue, but for sort of many mainstream American thinkers, this seems to be a sticking point in animal law. And one of the great things about looking to pluralistic practices, people around the world, and particularly the United States, who have developed animal law concepts, is that we can get new inputs and ideas and ways of looking at different animal law issues. So, with the meat eating example, Indigenous scholars have noted that the practices surrounding the life taking of animals for the consumption of meat is thought of to be not morally problematic if it's done in such a way that recognizes the sentience of the being and the offering of the animal life as an independent being for human consumption. And this can include things, the article details and more, but this can include things like offering a sacrifice or a thank you to the animal, treating the animal's body with care, using it wholly. And so I think looking at information like that can provide middle grounds or sort of in between places for some of the more pressing issues in animal laws, novel solutions of way of looking at things. And many people might feel differently about meat consumption, certainly not all, but some people might feel differently if we were treating animals with dignity and respect throughout their lives instead of using concentrated animal feeding operations and other things that seem to diminish the quality of life of other sentient beings. So this is one tiny example of one of the many ways in which moral pluralistic approaches that are informed by other cultures in the United States, most particularly indigenous cultures, can inform the way we think about animal law. So I'll sort of cabin that. Animal law, I believe, should begin with an analysis, with an analysis of indigenous law and practices. But then I'll sort of describe where animal law usually picks up, which is the importation of English common law into the United States. And we know, of course, that sort of the prevailing norm of how animals were treated in colonial United States until roughly the 1970s was largely premised on the idea that animals are the property of humans and exist for the sake of human use and consumption. So, with regard to some animals like livestock or domesticated animals, this means that humans own the animal, which is still the state of many animals in many places throughout the United States today. With respect to wildlife, animals were neither fully owned nor fully unowned, but were rather controlled or managed, and were subject to certain rights, such as the opportunity to cross or wander around even private land, but also could be reduced through property, through killing. With that famous case of Pearson versus Post and fox hunting in the United States, many students are uncritically introduced to the rights of animals in law school in a case that does not consider them as the holder of any rights whatsoever, and indeed the property of humans. So in the 1970s, there was this radical departure, right, from the state of animal rights as it was typically understood to something far different, which is the idea that animals are sentient beings, or at least some categories of animals are sentient beings, and they are subject to some degree of legal rights, not quite the full suite of human rights, but some degree of legal deference to the fact that they are sufficiently human-like to be afforded some degree of rights, right? And so the most famous sort of cases that have arisen on this have come from Stephen Weiss and the Non-Human Rights Project, which bring cases on behalf of highly sentient animals, animals whose science has clearly shown us are thoughtful, able to feel compassion, may have some linguistic skills. So these are tree animals high on what I'll probably refer to this several times today. So high on the so-called tree of life, the idea that there are humans at the top of this tree of life, and then subsequent sort of animals are categorized as different branches on the tree of life based upon how human-like they are. The idea that humans are the most of all species. No, I have to admit, I personally don't subscribe to the tree of life mindset. I think we simply choose the metrics that humans are good at and overlook things like echolocation as a potential metric, in which case bats or dolphins might be far higher on the tree of life than humans. So I think it's a somewhat rigged system. I think many species like bees and ants that are low on this idea of the tree of life are in fact quite sophisticated, and there's a great deal to learn and protect there. But the argument goes in animal rights, some creatures are sufficiently human-like that they ought to be afforded legal personhood. And most particularly, animals that are kept in captivity for fur or research, particularly very sentient animals like chimpanzees, primates in general, and orcas, should be afforded some degree of legal personhood and autonomy. So they're not merely the property of humans to do with what as they will, but they are instead subject to sort of a unique legal status where they may be independently afforded rights through human custodians. And human rights sort of application, or the rights of animals, animal rights, has really sort of evolved in the 1970s. There are a variety of thinkers who have advocated for this position. It has great public appeal, right? The idea that animals are more than the property of humans. And yet it's suffered in courts. It has not been tremendously successful in courts. And so animal right advocates around the country, organizations like PETA, the Humane Society does litigation, defenders of wildlife, et cetera, have been making these sort of hard fought gains for animals very, very slowly on the rights sort of angle, taking on this rights approach. And I think what the animal rights approach attempts to capture is the idea that animals are not merely the property of humans, and they never have been. Even if that's their legal status, we know, and this is increasingly true, that animals are tremendously important to people. Many people have primary relationships with animals that are as important as the relationships with many other human beings. And so the legal status of animals is out of step with the social treatment and understanding of animals. I think Professor Kysar has written really beautifully about this. There's this phrase he uses that I've thought of again and again, which is the unspeakable kinship of humans and animals. And I think this unspeakable kinship is precisely right. People understand that we have a relationship with or a connection to other living things, animals in particular, in such a way that it's very hard to define, and law has systemically failed to define it. And so animal rights as it exists has attempted to encapsulate in law or advance in law a different understanding of animals, one that is more consistent with how most people consider animals in their own lives. But the interesting thing is that one might think that the animal welfare perspective, the protection of animals, but animals fundamentally as property without human rights, and the animal rights perspective might coalesce. They might come together to advance the right of animals. But something somewhat surprising has happened, which is that these two groups of people, both of whom care very deeply about animals, these two legal sort of approaches to the treatment of animals, have divided. They've split, and there is animosity between the animal welfare and the animal rights approach. And instead of sort of directing the advocacy for animals outward, the field of animal law has sort of come to be defined by this fundamental split. And a great deal of energy and ink has been spilled trying to convince other animal advocates that either the welfare perspective or the rights perspective is the right way to go. That is the defining thing. And instead of taking a pluralistic and diverse approach to the field of animal law, it really has had this schism that to my mind, has fundamentally slowed the progress that could be made in the field. So one of the results of this sort of separated field of law is that we haven't seen many new or creative approaches arising from animal law. We really have welfare, which is the treatment of animals given their current social condition, and rights, which is the advocating for a new legal status of animals to create a heightened sense of rights and legal personhood, or something approaching legal personhood for animals. And what has happened in the interim has been quite sad. And this is particularly true for wildlife. So we know from the statistics that I read that the problem is that as these sort of battles between rights and welfare has unfolded, biodiversity is just in a nosedive. We are crashing on our treatment of wildlife. And in fact, neither the welfare approach nor the rights approach really emphasizes wildlife. It instead focuses on animals that are used for farming and fur and domesticated animals. So much of the law and legal energy that has been spent in the field of animal law focuses on categories of animals that have direct relationships with humans. The Animal Welfare Act, for example, the major piece of federal legislation that governs the treatments of animals by humans, completely exempts from the legal protections wide categories of animals, including things like birds, which are hugely important from a wildlife or ecosystem protection, and yet get virtually no protection under the Animal Welfare Act. So animal law has put its attention on animals that are closely related to humans. But the problem with this is multifaceted. Right. The first is that it relies on the idea of the tree of life. But we know scientifically that seemingly unimportant animals play tremendously important roles in ecosystems. And we are also learning very quickly that creatures like insects have much to teach us. They're remarkably sophisticated in ways that may not have been evident to people in the past. And so thinking of sentience or human-like characteristics is no longer a scientifically valid basis. Sort of the popular example of this, Barbara King talks about elephants and the way in which they breathe. There's a fantastic book about this. And scientists are just rapidly, at this unbelievable pace, beginning to expand our understanding of how so many different creatures, including those which most people may never see in their lives, have rich inner lives, social systems, emotional working, etc., which is likely deserving of legal protection. The second thing, so that's sort of the first problem, right? Wildlife are systemically excluded or not really paid attention to under traditional animal law approaches. The second thing is wildlife is just as connected to human behavior as other living things. We just didn't recognize it in the past. So the one piece of major federal legislation that sort of most protects wildlife is the Endangered Species Act. And even as it was being enacted in the 1970s, we understood, or Congress understood, that the driving problem behind biodiversity loss between creatures becoming extinct, which was then thought of as a sort of problem for that individual species, and is today thought of more broadly as an ecosystem problem that can lead to the subsequent collapse of other species. But the fundamental driver of species becoming extinct was essentially a habitat or land-based problem. And we knew that in the 1970s, and yet the Endangered Species Act, although it's accomplished much for animals, has never fully achieved its promise with respect to the establishing of habitat to reduce biodiversity or species loss. And so what has essentially happened over time is that animals or wildlife, we've always known the problem, and yet we've allowed it to become worse and worse and worse and worse. And in this way, I think we're equally capable today, given how much we know about human land development affecting biodiversity for the loss of wildlife, as we are for animals in captivity or livestock that are treated inappropriately. Even though we don't see the wildlife that starve to death or are sort of in areas that have insufficient resource density because of human land development, habitat-based problems for wildlife, I believe we're equally culpable for those animals as we are for the animals that are killed directly at the hands of human beings. And that's, I admit, a controversial point. Some people might feel that the treatment of livestock in captive facilities is far more problematic, but I think we are equally culpable. I truly do, for the gradual diminishment of wildlife, the loss of each individual animal that is directly traceable to human activity through land development, the replacing of traditional animal habitat with things like subdivision, agricultural uses, etc., that are pushing animals off the land such that they can no longer continue to exist. And if we have that degree of culpability, there becomes a question of why is animal law not adequately addressing the problem of wildlife? Why is wildlife thought of as something different from animal law in general? And I think that that is in some ways a story of property law. So having defined animal law in sort of three ways, looking at the indigenous roots of animal law, animal welfare as it's traditionally defined, and also animal rights, this newer since the 1970s attempt to establish legal personhood or some degree of legal human rights for animals. Having defined what animal law is, I'm now going to set it aside and look to property law. And the reason I'm making this switch, which is frankly somewhat new to link animal law to property law, is because wildlife sits at the intersection of these topics. And property law is interesting in that really, we think we all know property law. Virtually every lawyer in the United States has studied property law. And yet it's really sort of this interesting construct. And if you take a step back from the field generally, you see that so many different fields that we think of as distinct, including animal law, are in fact interwoven with property law in really interesting and important ways. So land use law, natural resources law, energy law, water law, oil and gas law, wildlife law, these are all in some ways intertwined with property law because property is in some ways the backbone of how human relationships with the natural environment have been defined in the United States since the imposition of colonial English common law. And so with property law, we receive a body of animal law, although we don't typically call it that, about the treatment of wildlife, how wildlife should be managed and understood. And when we think about how we sort of got here in this problem of biodiversity crisis, I believe that the answer rests in property law because property law is a construct. It's a legal construct that gives ownership of things, but it denies a fundamental biological reality. And I believe this is just a flaw. It's a fatal flaw, I think, but it's a flaw in property law as it was imported to the United States by English colonialists. So the way in which English common law came was, of course, through the imposition of colonial standards, but the way in which it was developed has a historic context that matters, which is English common law, like every legal system, ours included, is in fact much more pluralistic than we generally give it credit for. For example, Viking, Dane law influenced English common law, many different sets of law. Any legal system is in fact the distillation of the best ideas over time, handed down through precedent, statute, generation after generation, where judges receive a body of law, they apply it to their current circumstances, informed by their current conditions and judgments, and then pass it on to the next generation. And in some ways, this is beautiful. Much like oral histories or sagas or even the flight patterns of migrating birds, you have this intergenerational transfer of wisdom that happens with property law. But sometimes, of course, we know that there's a bug in the code. There's a problem in the property law, and that too gets transmitted and transferred over time. And property law that was established in a very, very small island with very different climatic conditions was then transported across an ocean and applied to a landmass that was many, many, many times bigger, which has important legal implications, and also very, very different. And so the imposition of English colonial law as it applies to wildlife specifically, the problem with it is that it fails to address the idea of this sort of wild space of the United States because it was developed in a context in which much of the wildness and much of the wildlife had already been exterminated in England. And so by applying English principles to the United States, you had this mismatch between the law on the books as it was in existence and the underlying social, political, economic, geographic, geological, and climatic conditions of the United States. And I think the fundamental flaw for our purposes in English common law is this unspoken assumption that animals could not own property. And this was at odds with many indigenous conceptions in which humans were co-participants of the shared resources of the earth with every other living thing. And so it's really simple, right? English common law just assumed animals didn't own. And yet, that assumption has fundamentally altered the fate of wildlife throughout North America because every law that derives from English common law imposes with it this unspoken assumption that there is no sort of place for animals. So the law doesn't look at all like the natural environment. On my little 1 acre lot in Phoenix, I have javelina, bobcats, coyotes, roadrunners, my personal favorite, quail. I have all these other species that live on my property. And that's the biological reality of where I live. I'm living with other creatures. But if you were to walk into the county recorder's office in Maricopa County, you would find that I am the owner of that property. Right? That's a fundamental mismatch. We think only humans can own, and that was a mistake, but no one realized it at the time, right? Or I should say, English colonists didn't realize it at the time. It's entirely possible that indigenous peoples may have recognized that problem. But what has happened when we assume the primacy of a legal system that did not account for wildlife interests is we essentially put the nail in the coffin of wildlife. And it was completely unclear at that time what the long-term effects would be. But we have pounded away at that nail over time as we have increased population, as we have urbanized, as we have spread this law and this legal system and this way of looking at the world and the relationship between humans and animals throughout the United States. Particularly as we have climatic pressures and we have population growth, humans are driving animals off the land because animals have no sort of fundamental rights to the land itself. And this is a mistake, right? But it doesn't have to be this way. And I think the sort of main point of the main point of the book, if you will, is to offer an alternative worldview, a different way in which animals and humans can coexist. And that's this model where humans and animals jointly own property, and the legal reality reflects the biological reality. That is, that animals can own land. So this is a new path in animal law. It's a new approach or new opportunity to think about the ways in which animals and humans might better reflect in law the way that they actually exist in the biological reality. And this, I believe, has the opportunity to reverse this trend that we see towards biodiversity loss. So I am sure in question and answer, we'll have many opportunities to talk about how specifically this proposal plays out, but understanding the problem and how we got there might serve to provide the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bradshaw, for that wonderful presentation and really engaging and sweeping overview of the book.